Hello, hello. I guess good afternoon, good morning, and good night, depending on where you are in the world. Steve is joining us from what time is it, Steve?
It's like 10 a.m. Yeah.
10 a.m. All right, so we got a good morning at least. Thank you all for joining us. We're gonna let people in joining in here over the next minute or so. And while you're joining, we just want to put this disclaimer up. This webinar is being recorded, so by unmuting your microphone and or enabling your camera, you're consenting to be included in the recording. We will be putting this out on all of our socials. The LinkedIn, well, that's all I've got. I don't know. Do you have any other socials, Steve? You probably have plenty.
No, I actually don't. I've gotten rid of all of the rest of them.
Well, we're excited for this conversation. Thanks to everybody who's joined in. We're going to get started here, and just a quick introduction of who we are, and then we're going to let Steve really dive in and break down how we can all scale our impact with our mental health innovations. I'm Jason Limbach. I'm joined here from the Thrive Center with Kinsley, and we are both building out the innovation hub at the Thrive Center at Georgetown, which we'll tell you more about at the end of today's conversation. But the gist of what we're looking to do is support innovators, both for-profit and nonprofit, and scaling the impact that they can have in helping kids and families thrive. And so we are so excited today to have Steve join us and really kind of break down insights that he's seen in his deep dive research across the mental health landscape. So we're going to hand it over to Steve. He's going to present some I think keen insights for everybody to learn from. But as he's going through the conversation, please feel free to chime in with questions. We're not going to just sit here and all watch Steve present away. We'll be able to chime in and have conversation with him as he's going through the information he has to share. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Steve. Thanks for taking us through this. We're excited to jump in.
No, thank you. It's yeah, this is really fun actually. I love talking about this stuff. So getting the opportunity to nerd out on it for like 45 minutes or an hour is like my dream Friday morning. So yeah, welcome everybody. What we're gonna go through today is essentially these 5 lessons for mental health startups. And really what we're focusing a lot on is how do you achieve like the sustainability and like the scale that you probably want to achieve with your startup to have the impact that you want to have, right? So most of us are like doing this thing because there's a certain impact goal that we want to have. We want to help people, patients, providers, to really try and like improve outcomes from the mental health perspective. And so we're kind of going to go chat through a bunch of the stuff that I think would be quite helpful for you to learn from some of the analysis that I've done over the past couple of years. In terms of who I am, so I have a mustache now, actually, so I should probably update this photograph. But my background was I worked at McKinsey and Company, where I was working with a bunch of different like companies, but then also with governments and health systems. And so really at the high level kind of like strategy kind of side. And then I spent 5 years working in 2 different startups. So I was quite lucky. Both of them went on to be unicorns. One of them was in the fintech space, so nothing to do with mental health. But then the other one was a healthcare startup as well. And so I basically learned a bunch around what it takes to actually have a sustainable business model for a startup, what it takes to grow, and all of the kind of pains that you have to get through that are very real in startups, and how do you try and get over them, right? Because it's a tough job. And then for the last couple of years, I've been specifically focused on the mental health space. And a lot of the insights and the analysis come from this thing called the Hemingway Report, which is what I started, where I basically write a weekly long form newsletter analyzing a lot of the trends in the mental health space, specifically doing a lot of company deep dives. So trying to understand like what's working, what's not working when people have failed, rather than just jumping on the bandwagon of, kind of critiquing them, saying like, well, what can we learn from them? What can this mean for like the next batch of startups that come through? And so that's a lot of like the insights that I have today. And I also work with some really interesting companies in this space. I'm still kind of like trying to be at the call front and get insights from that perspective too. So this is what we're going to talk today. We're going to go through 5 of these lessons. As you're saying earlier, like jump in with like questions. Let's keep it conversational. And yeah, let's go. So the first one, which is some of these are going to be obvious to you, right? Or they might seem obvious, but I think it's really important to restate them. And the first one is that you really have to prioritize clinical outcomes. And if you don't have clinical outcomes, you can kind of forget about any sort of impact or commercial outcomes, right? This is like completely necessary to achieving not only what you want to do from in terms of helping patients, which is very obvious, but it's really, really hard to have any sort of commercial success if you're not significantly moving the needle on clinical outcomes. And the reason for that is that, inertia is very, very strong. If you think about whether it's providers, whether it's payers, or health systems more broadly, you need to be doing something that's like markedly better for them to justify them actually adopting something new and changing out from their existing behavior. And we're going to talk a little bit around what that looks like from an adoption perspective later on. But it's really, really important that you're creating something that's significantly better from a clinical outcome perspective. And the ways that I think about this, like very basically, is you can actually improve like the outcome just in general, whether that's if you're focusing on depression and you're able to help people with depression and get better more often or more quickly, that's obviously a great thing. But then the other element is you can reduce costs, right? So you can deliver like similar outcomes but at a much lower cost, which is obviously extremely helpful to the system. And then you can improve access as well, right? So even if you're not necessarily delivering some new form of treatment, if you're able to get that treatment to reach more people, that's obviously very positive from a clinical outcome perspective. And the types of people that, whether it's patients or providers or payers, are going to really, really care about that. Assuming that you're doing that and that you're delivering clinical outcomes, somewhere where a lot of people fall down is that they fail to actually prove it. And they get into this bit of a vicious cycle where they say, well, I need to, run this trial to be able to prove my outcomes. And to do that, I'm going to need to raise money because these things are expensive. But whenever I go and try and raise money from somebody, that they tell me that I need to have the trial done already in order to raise a capital, right? And so you can kind of get caught in this little bit of a vicious circle. And so, but it's really, really important that you're proving your outcomes. One way to kind of get around this that I've seen with a company, a company who are a really good example of this is a company called Mindset Health, which I'd encourage you to check out. And I wrote about them before. And what they do is they were like at every stage of their growth, with the capital and the resources they had available to them at that time, they were saying, well, what outcomes can I prove today, right, with what I have available to me, rather than waiting and saying, oh, well, in 2 years' time, when we have this capital, we're going to do and run the big trial, and we're going to wait until then. They're saying, well, even if it's with our own data, or even if it's with like really small scale research studies that we can do today, what can we prove? And they're kind of laddering up the whole time, right? So they're always building that evidence base. And that then allowed them to, get a little bit of capital, which then unlocks the next level of research that they're able to do and prove even more outcomes. So I think,
quick comment on that, Steve. I mean, we were just having this conversation with a bunch of researchers at Georgetown, and these are PhD level folks who are doing the deep dive research work, and they have the same advice and feedback, which is that you already have the data, you have the access to the end customer, the end community. And I love that example you shared, because like that's an example where they leaned into it and they started measuring and understanding their impact. Maybe informal, maybe qualitative, but that's still data that can help you understand, are you driving towards outcomes, and how do you ladder? I like that framing. How do you ladder up to more and better research over time? But don't wait for 2 years and PhDs to get started.
100%. Like it's all about that laddering, proving what you can with what you have. And then, because then that unlocks the next layer, right? There's going to be, some payers or some providers who are like really forward thinking and will actually, don't need to wait for your RCT for them to try out or pilot like your product. They're happy for it to take it on with just the evidence that you've been able to develop yourself. And so, yeah, I completely agree, Jason.
Do you thinking about you gave an example of somebody who's done this. I think, yeah, I can imagine the concern around, well, we don't have the money, the research partner, the kind of access to the expertise. Do you think that there are tips or tricks that you've seen from some of these organizations, how they've started small and built that first step on the ladder up on evidence?
I think like one thing that I've seen work is trying to find the people, the researchers specifically, who are just really bought into what you're doing, right? Um, and who might do it just because this is the area that they really, really care about, and they're able to help you out and guide you in the right direction. So I think that's one thing. It's like it's not easy, but especially if you're just starting off, it's like who are your champions going to be? Who are the people? Where can you find them that are like just super passionate about the thing that you're trying to create, the research that you want to do, and they can help you out. So I think that's one. And then I think the second thing is like just the challenge that you have a lot in startups is just like doing what you can with what you have, right? It's like being a little bit scrappy. And again, it mightn't be perfect data. It mightn't be like super large sample sizes. But again, if it can be meaningful, and then, doing that, and then, maybe you do that and then you bring that to the researcher and you say, hey, like this is what we've already got. And that excites them a bit more than coming with nothing. So there'd be a couple of the ways that I've seen people do it.
That's cool. And I think there's a misconception of the researchers want to stay in the ivory tower. Like there's a real energy, at least with certain researchers, that they want to engage with you because they know that they don't have all the data, they don't have access to the community at the level that you do. And so I think putting your 2 points together, like you got to sell to investors, you got to sell to customers, you got to sell to partners, get to work on selling researchers. And one of the tips we heard from one of the awesome researchers at Georgetown is like reach out to grad students because they're scrappy themselves. They're looking for new data, new approaches, and they want to engage. So I think that's a great. Those are two great areas to get started on.
100%. Yep, I agree. Okay, so let's move on to the second one, which I think is a very big area of interest for pretty much every mental health startup. And that's about designing a sustainable business model. Where I see people fail, the vast majority of the time is because they haven't been able to crack this. And it's because it's really hard, right? Healthcare is hard. Mental health care is probably even harder. You might have developed a fantastic product from a clinical perspective. You've ticked the box on number one. You've got a bunch of research behind you. But unless you're able to actually do this step, it's really unlikely that you're going to be able to reach the level of scale and impact that you're hoping for. And so when we talk about business model, like what do we actually mean, right? That's really important. And I think there's three components of it that are very simple, but I love as a framework for it. So the first one is that you know exactly who your customer is and you know what they value. What are their specific problems and what are they willing to pay for if you can solve them? I think the second one is then, do you have a right to actually deliver this value? Are you actually able to deliver the value that they need to them? That's super, super important. And then the third one, which is probably the one that's most overlooked, is can you do so at an appropriate cost? Because unless you have alignment across all of these three, you really don't have like a sustainable business model that can scale. And I'm going to show you a couple of examples of when it's worked and also when it hasn't. So one of the really, really large companies who tried to tackle mental health over the past few years was a company called Achilles. They're a digital therapeutics company. And they had some real challenges with their business model. And they were kind of targeting a lot of different people, but they kind of selected like insurers as their primary customer. But their products actually weren't able to deliver value, the kind of value that these payers were actually interested in. And then, worse than all, they couldn't do so at a low enough cost, right? So they complete misalignment with who they were trying to serve, what they were trying to give to those people, but then also they had built this massive cost base where they were spending so much money on research and development, on sales and marketing, on hiring large sales teams, that there was no mismatch. There was a complete mismatch between the cost that they would have needed to be able to sell their product for, and then the cost base that they had developed in their company, and they were never going to be able to deliver the product at that cost. And so, unfortunately, like Achilles ended up not working out. And Pear Therapeutics were another similar company in this space that had a similar problem, and they just didn't have alignment across these three elements of their business model. But then there's one that I think is a really good example of where it has worked. So Flow Neuroscience are a company in Europe. They most of their market now is in the UK, where they've successfully selling into the NHS. They have an at-home TDCS device, which is used for the treatment of depression. Um, and so they have a great business model because what they've done is they saw that health systems are going to be their main customer, right? So selling to the NHS in the UK. And they figured out that they can actually deliver value to them by improving depression outcomes for patients. This is a serious problem for the NHS and especially serious problem for the cost of that they have trying to deliver this type of treatment. And so what Flow did, they were like, okay, we know that we can deliver value to this system, but at what costs can we deliver this? How much are they willing to pay? And they realized that actually, these public health systems, they don't have a whole amount of money, especially on a per patient basis. And so they realized that unless they had a low cost model for doing this, it would never be sustainable. And a lot of their competitors are in like the thousands of euro or pence, right? And so they were like, unless we're able to develop a headset, which is, around the 400 or 500 bucks mark, this is never going to be sustainable. And so that's exactly what they did. And so the interesting thing here, though, is what they did with their business around this. So everything from their manufacturing to the factories they use to all of their design decisions in their headset to how they treat sales and marketing, which they've kept super, super lean, is all about keeping the costs low so that they have alignment between the price that their payers are willing to pay for it and the cost that they're able to deliver their headset to them at. And so what's really important when we think about business model is that oftentimes we actually don't think about it that much. We think a lot about innovation on like the product, right? So what can we do to develop some new interesting product? But we're really not innovating on our business model. And most of the successful companies outside of mental health are actually businesses who have innovated on business model. Like a classic example is Netflix, right? They came up with an entirely new business model. Yes, it's a new product, but also having a subscription service to be able to watch content at home is a very, very new business model. And that's what allowed them to succeed. And so I would really think about, just spend time thinking about what is your business model? Who exactly are you trying to serve? What do they value? How do you deliver that value specifically to them? And then most importantly, how do you do so at a cost base that's acceptable? And then once you have all of that, you can use it to align your entire business. It's no use trying to deliver a low cost product or a mid cost product, but then having a cost base in your R&D team or in your sales and marketing that's completely misaligned with that. So once you have it, and you have it structured well, then you should be getting all the departments at your business aligned behind it.
Do you think, just based on all the businesses you've reviewed, are there patterns? Do people get stuck on the cost side, like the example you raised, where their cost is over water versus their revenues, or what are some patterns for people to look out underneath that?
I think a lot of it is cost, right? And a lot of it is cost around specifically in sales and marketing because it's really hard to get these things adopted. And then you say, okay, well, do we need to get a sales team to go out and talk to all the healthcare providers? And we need to be running, paid ads to get patients to actually use this thing or to ask their provider about it. And very suddenly, unless you're really, really good at that, we're going to talk a little bit about it later, those costs can become pretty significant. And then when you look at, oh, gee, well, it costs us, $500 to get our product into somebody's hands. Well, then suddenly your cost has to be significantly more than that if you want to make any margin. So I think that's number one. And then I think the second one, which is probably even more fundamental, is making sure that you're actually delivering real value to the customer. And in healthcare, obviously, customer is like a tricky word, but like if we think about it from a patient perspective, I think a lot about it's like, does the patient really want this thing? Like, is this something that is really, really going to deliver value to them, or is it kind of just like a nice to have, right? Like the YC slogan of like make something people want. I think actually we can take a lot of inspiration from that in mental health. Like, are you really making something that's genuinely going to impact this person's life? Because unless you're doing, that first part of delivering that value to them, then it's really hard to make any of the rest of it work.
Yeah, I think that this broader point of we're all in kind of a B to C to B or whichever orientation you want of the flow of it, right? But that leads to more cost. So you have to be conscious of that, right? Because many times you got to sell into a system and then ultimately get the inpatient to use it. And then to your value point, it's the same thing. Like the patients and what they value could be and likely will be different than what the partner might value. And so it's like a bit of a maze, but you have to really orient around all of that and understand that. Kinsey, you want to pull in the question we got from the chat?
Yes, I was going to say we have a chat question from Malika, which was, what are some ways to truly validate if you're solving a key and urgent pain point for a payer, especially if you're looking at large players in consolidated markets?
Great question. I'm not sure that I have a good answer for this. I mean, look, the difficult but best answer is if you were able to talk to them, right? Not even from like a sales or a marketing perspective, but even if you're able to get into conversations with these people in any way, just to say, hey, look, I'm not trying to sell to you, but like, this is what I'm trying to build. Or actually maybe even leave that out for a while, right? Just say, what are your biggest problems? Like, what keeps you guys up late at night? Like, what are you struggling with? What are like your big agendas when you look at mental health or behavioral health this year over the next couple of years? And really just like that kind of research to try and understand exactly what those problems are. And then I think the second thing is like, go and try and sell to them, right? Even obviously really difficult to sell to a lot of payers, especially like the larger ones, and certainly in more consolidated markets. But there's nothing more humbling than actually going and trying to sell these things to them, because you'll figure out pretty quickly whether you're actually solving a problem that they care about or not. And that's the best kind of feedback that you can get. I think the third thing is like just trying to think through yourself about the incentives of different payers and saying like, okay, well, what do they care about? And some really obvious ones, right? So it's just like when you understand their business model a bit, you can understand like they have to keep their costs down, right? Unfortunately, they're not hugely incentivized to invest in preventative stuff because most of their members churn off them within a couple of years, right? These are like the realities of the system that we operate in. And if you can kind of think through them a little bit from first principles and really put yourselves in the shoes of the payers and the industry that they're operating in, whether we like it or not, there's a bunch of like incentives and disincentives that we have to deal with. And then that can probably help you to think about, well, does your solution fit into those incentives and the things that they care about? Awesome. So we talked a little bit about go to market and the spend associated with kind of sales and marketing, but I think let's get into it in a bit more detail because this is a really big challenge for a lot of companies. My number one lesson is that you should prove your go to market model before you start heavily investing in growth. This is a serious challenge for a lot of companies in this space where they do it backwards. And it's a very, very quick way to fail. So here's a data from a couple of companies that I analyzed. So we mentioned Achille and Pear Therapeutics. And so this was, I think, just for a single quarter. Achille, the blue is how much they spent on their sales and general admin expenses. And then this is how much revenue they had in the orange. And so Achille spent $45 million in selling expenses essentially for about $2 million of revenue. Per Therapeutics, kind of like a similar thing. Talkspace back in 2022, and they had, they were almost spending as much on just selling as they were making in total revenue. And so, I mean, of course, especially with Achille and Pear, of course, these guys were going to go out of business with this and this level of spend. So you really have to make sure that you have a go-to-market model that if you put $1 in, you're getting back out at the very least more than $1, right? Hopefully you're getting back $3 or $4. And so you're thinking about, depending on your product, your service, you're going to need to think about all the different parts of that go-to-market model, because it's not just selling to the customer. As Jason said, it's also about getting your patients to use it, or sometimes it's about getting providers to prescribe your product, whatever else it is. but you need to have all of those elements working before you go and start spending significant money in it. It sounds so obvious, but obviously, some people aren't are still making that mistake. You can see it. People are getting the idea now. This is Talkspace's. Basically, their sales and marketing spend is a percentage of their revenue. So they were spending, 71% back at the start of 2022, and over time they've realized we have to pull this down. It's completely inefficient. So this is both the business model point, but also, I wish that I bet they wish they had figured out whatever they're doing in Q3 2024 4 or 5 years ago before they burnt a whole load of cash trying to grow with an unproven go-to-market model. So I think there's a couple of like specific lessons that we can take from thinking about the go-to-market model. The first is that I always think about working backwards. So the first one about that is like removing leaks from your revenue pipeline. So if you think about you should think about what are the steps that need to happen for me to actually get $1 of revenue, right? Is that, the prescriber, a prescriber needs to prescribe my product, and then, the patient needs to actually fulfill that prescription. And then obviously I need to get reimbursed. That's one that we'll talk about in a second. But just looking at that whole cycle and making sure that there's no leaks in that, right? Because if you've got a leak in that bucket and you start pouring water into the top of it, it's going to be extremely inefficient. What you want to do is like fix up your bucket first. And then once you know that it's solid and there's no leaks or very little, then you can be more confident in pouring water in the top. Same thing, in general, like everybody wants to think about new business. So like acquisition, what new customers am I getting? What new patients, what new payers, whatever else. Retention is way more important, like way, way more important. Are your people sticking with you? Whether that's, the payers, the providers, the patients, are they actually continually using your product? Are they engaged with it? Are they still paying for it over time? Because again, otherwise you've got this large scale leaky funnel. Once you have that and you know that your retention is strong, then you know how much a customer is going to be worth for you over the next 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years. That gives you much more confidence in investing in getting a new customer because you know what they're going to pay you. And thirdly, really try and make sure that you've got profitability on a unit basis, right? So that when you look at, back to my point earlier, if I spend $1 to get a new customer, I know that that's going to turn into $3 of revenue, and ideally I've got a good gross margin on that too, because that basically means if I scale that from $1 to $10, I'm actually making money. I'm not losing money. Basic maths, but again, you'd be surprised how many people aren't thinking about it in this way. And then the fourth one that I'll talk about in a sec is essentially that loops are better than funnels. But that's a bit more, I'll save that for a sec. So when you talk about leaks, right, this was, I think, from data that I analyzed with Pear. So I think in the first 3 quarters of 2022, they were able to get 31,000 prescriptions written, right? So like, great, like they've got this FDA approved product. They're actually able to reach PCPs and do all that hard work and spend that money to actually get them to prescribe their product. But of that, there was a 58% drop off to the patients actually fulfilling them, right? So this is all just like lost revenue to them. And then of those that were fulfilled, there was another 41% drop off to those that were reimbursed, right? So you could look at this number and be like, amazing, we've got 31,000 prescriptions written, but only 7,000 of them got this is obviously the only number you get paid for, right? And so you really need to make sure that you don't have as many leaks in your funnel, because this is like 4x the difference, right? Which is going to have a massive impact on your unit economics. Super important. You need somebody to pay for your thing and you need people to use it. So when you're thinking about both retention and acquisition, you need to be thinking about this quadrant. Do we have it across all 4? Whoever it is that's the ultimate user of your product, are you able to retain them over time? And then have you found a way to actually acquire them at a decent cost? And then the exact same thing for payers, right? So if you can tick all 4 of these boxes, then I would say, okay, great. You've got that. You don't have many leaks in your funnel. I'd be quite confident then that you can go and start investing in scaling your go-to-market. And the last point that I'll just probably go over relatively quickly, and maybe share some links for people who are interested in learning more about it, is that loops are better than funnels. When we think about growing businesses or growing products, it's much better to think about them as a system of loops, not necessarily funnels. We think about marketing very often as, we've got this like classic funnel and it comes down and, then at the end of it, we've got customers. But actually, if we're able to think about it as a loop, which is how most of the highest growth companies have thought about their products and their businesses, we're able to build much more successful and sustainable businesses. That's because loops provide compounding benefits and they're also defensible. And so really what we're talking about here is when you get to the bottom of your funnel and you've got a new customer or a payer at the bottom of that, is that helping you to drive the top of your funnel, right? Or is it actually just every time they just come in and then that's it, and you've got to spend the same amount of time, effort, and money to get your next person, right? So really easy ways is like if you're able to if you have any sort of network effects in your business, obviously that hugely helps, because if you get a new customer, that adds value to your product, which makes it easier to get the next customer. But even basic stuff like being able to get testimonials, building evidence is a huge one. If you were able to say, oh yeah, well, we've got 1,000 customers and we were able to build evidence from those 1,000 customers, and then we were able to use that evidence to get the next 1,000, now you've actually started to go a loop rather than just a funnel, which is super important.
Are there any examples of health tech or mental health companies that you could point to that say, oh, these guys, they've got the loop stuff dialed in?
I don't think anybody has it dialed in, to be honest with you. I'm thinking about flow and neuroscience a little bit, because what they can get to is they can get to economies of scales, which drives the cost of their product down, right? So if you're developing a headset, the first 100 headsets that you develop are going to be super expensive because manufacturers are going to, charge you quite a lot on a per headset basis for that. But over time, as you grow, you're going to get economies of scale. And, if you're ordering 10,000 headsets, you're going to be able to do that at a lot lower price. That drives your cost down. And if you've got lower costs, that's obviously going to mean more customers into like the top of your loop. So I think that's one way that it definitely works. I think it's quite a tricky one, because there's no virality in mental health care products usually. They're usually not community driven, like they're not interesting ones. I think I find are ones that are more like content driven, right? So I've seen a couple of companies that have like kind of communities within them, and so the more people that join those communities or products, and if they're creating content and sharing content, then the value of that network goes up, which means that more people want to join. So I know a couple of companies who kind of building communities for people with neurodivergence or disability or living with chronic health conditions. And you can see how the first couple of people who joined that community is probably, crickets, right? But now there's like hundreds of thousands of people in there, which means that the value of that community goes up, which means it's easier to acquire the next people.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think I think a classic startup mistake that echoes and underlines what you're saying is that people will get lost in growth hacking rather than your points of retention, and you're going to get to engagement, but this idea of like really honing in on how do you make your customers come back? How do you get them to come back and engage with you? And ideally find a loop off of that. But the separation or the overemphasis on growth hacking, to your earlier point, before you're ready to scale with your unit economics, versus I think a lot of times the underemphasis of engagement and retention.
100%, 100%. And I mean, I'll put it this way, right? If a company came to me, two companies came to me, company A, company B, and company A was like, hey, I've only got 100 users, but they use my thing all the time, right? And they've been with me for 12 months and they're super active and they pay me, and I can make money, based on delivering my service to them. And then I had another one who had like 10,000 users, but they were like, yeah, I've got 20% monthly churn, and actually on a unit economics basis, I lose money. I'm like, oh, let's talk to company A. That's way more interesting, because we know that we've got something that works there, and then it's just about pouring fuel on the fire. And the obvious thing is like when you're in search of growth, you can get a bit desperate. You want to go for the acquisition, just like the growth hacks, all that sort of stuff. I totally get it. But I think like really thinking deeply about retention and engagement, unit economics, and finding that like go-to-market model that actually is sustainable. If you can get that right, just take your time, to get that right, then when you're ready, you'll take off. Okay, great. We've got a couple more. So the next one is a really interesting point, which I kind of battle with a lot, or have battled with a lot with the companies I've worked with, and it's never relying on should, right? And there's a couple of great quotes I think about this. One from a wonderful health blogger that I follow, probably a lot of you do too, and she's talking about how a startup's biggest threat isn't a direct competitor or even the incumbents. It's the inertia, how things have always been, right? So we talked about that earlier. There's a huge amount of inertia, like in healthcare, right? Like the status quo is just like so strong. And I talk to so many like great founders who've built something and they're so passionate about it. And they're like, but my thing is amazing. Like, I can't understand, like, why don't people use this? Like, they should use it. And I agree with them, but I'm like, unfortunately, like, we can't rely on should, right? We have to think more deeply around adoption if you want to scale your product. And that's just because adoption is super hard. There's another quote from Clayton Christensen, which I love, which is that the graveyard of failed products is populated by things that people should have wanted, if only they could have been convinced that those things were good for them, right? So this is kind of back to a little bit our point around the business model as well. It's just like, what do people actually value today, right? What are their revealed preferences? Like when we look at their actual behavior. So a way I think about this is there's a huge amount of conversation around the role of AI in mental health right now, specifically around AI companions or AI therapists, right? And it's obviously super important that we develop something that's very safe and clinically effective before we go and deliver that to people at scale. But if you look at the revealed preferences of what people are doing, people are using other stuff all the time at a massive scale to treat their mental health, right? If you look at the amount of people using ChatGPT for it, there's a psychologist and companion on Character AI, which has zero evidence behind it. I think it's had 150 million conversations with people about their mental health, right? Which is terrifying and dangerous. But I'm like, that is a revealed preference of what people are already doing. So now within that space, we can build something that's safe and clinically effective. We don't have to rely on should. They're already showing us what they want to do. Like to kind of wrap up this point, I think it's like another quote from Christensen where he's talking about, let's look at essentially the people that what they're already trying to do. What are the jobs that they're already in their life, they're trying to get done. And this is, I think, also really important if you're building something for providers, like if you're in the space of building provider tools. A lot of people build something, oh, but the provider should use my, AI note-taking summary because it, is able to give them better insights into the consultations that they're having. And I'm like, yeah, but if they're not already trying to get that done, if you need to go in and say, well, you should change your behavior to go and do my other thing over here, that's quite difficult. But if you can go to them and you can say, hey, you're already trying to do this every day in your work. I've got a more affordable, better way for you to do it. That's a much easier sell. And so I think really when you're thinking about your products, try not to rely too much on should, and try and really be honest with yourself about what the existing behavior, the existing demands are, and then try to build around that.
I love that. I like one of the things I've been very conscious of in supporting entrepreneurs, especially in these important spaces, is that your competition, as you've kind of hit on, is basically TikTok and Netflix, right? Like you're trying to engage with them and engage on something that is sensitive, challenging for them. So you have to really like that. That's such a great framework of should is just doesn't cut it because they're not going to go.
100%. I think this is especially important if you're building something for children or young people, right? So I work with a lot of people, I see their products and they're like, oh, but if a child uses this, it reduces like their depression risk by X% or something. And I was like, kids don't care. I wish they did, they should, but they don't. Like,
Yeah.
So we need to think about what they do care about. What are they already trying to do? And I think it's just about living in that, trying to live as much as possible in that like very real, tangible, and frustrating world, as opposed to a somewhat idealistic one.
A quick, fun insight off of that we've heard now from a number of entrepreneurs is this discovery that for teenagers in particular, like scheduling appointments for even kind of peer-to-peer support, they just kind of laugh. They're like, we don't have a calendar. Like, so they
Yeah.
instead they're
Yeah.
doing like office hours or on demand, right? Which is what they're used to. It's sort of to your point on the chat bot thing, right? It's just like calendar, a Google Gmail invite is not going to land well with a teenager.
That's such a great point. Yeah, you're so right. You're so right. Okay, so that brings me up to point number 5, which is, I would say, an important lesson, but also one that you should be very, very aware of, but sometimes there's not a whole lot you can do about it. And that's about watching your timing, right? So specifically, first isn't always best, right? Oftentimes in a lot of markets, it's actually better to be second and to get to benefit from all the work that the first couple of people had to do. And we can see this I'll show you in a second, but there's a couple of different timelines that we can think about when we think about trying to build a business. So one is around customer perception, right? Like if you tried to launch an AI chatbot, 15 years ago, that customer behavior probably wasn't there. The perception of these things would have been a lot more kind of hostile to it. Now, with a lot of people, especially for certain age groups, it's a very, very accepted thing, right? So you can just launch it, and the customer, you're at a timeline in the customer perception is much more supportive. And similarly, technology availability, there's a lot of stuff that you couldn't do. This is either from like a platform basis, right? So if you wanted to have a VR startup 10 years ago, would have been much more tricky than it is today. And if we look at so many of the startups in mental health right now, they're all mobile apps. Why? Because we have a mobile platform that everybody has in their pocket. So that's really important to understand where you are and in kind of the timeline of different technology. Regulatory environment, super important too. Like we see this a lot in mental health, whether it's with digital therapeutics or even if you're in the drug space, especially around like psychedelics, as a regulatory environment, you could have just been too early, right? And that's really tough. But if you're able to be at the right timing of the market, then it's super supportive. Similarly, from a reimbursement perspective, and then finally capital markets, right? So your ability to raise funds, if you're at a good point in the capital markets, then it's going to be easier for you to raise funds. Ideally, you are somewhat robust to some of this timing, right? So especially say something like capital markets, ideally you're able to say, okay, I'm actually able to survive and ride out, a bad time period in the capital market environment, and I can wait for it to come around again because it's more cyclical. So ideally, you have a business that is somewhat robust to this, but of course, it's going to massively affect you. An example of this is like we talked a bit about Pear Therapeutics and Achille. They were digital therapeutics companies. Both of them went out of business. Pear sold their assets for $6 million after bankruptcy. And then just recently, we had kind of big news from about kind of new changes to Medicare and Medicaid reimbursement scheduling, which is going to be much more supportive of digital therapeutics. And I'd imagine like Pear and Achille are just like, oh, like where was this like 4 years ago, right? So they were folks who went out and had to kind of be the first at scale people trying to do this in the market. It's much easier if you come along now as a second or third generation company in this space, because you're going to benefit from a better regulatory and reimbursement environment. I've got one more actually, just before we finish up, a little bonus one. As we're talking about capital markets, it's really important to choose a funding strategy that matches your goals, right? So a lot of people, when they think about building a business, obviously go think about VCs. VCs can play a really important role. A lot of amazing businesses have been built off the back of venture investment, but it's also not the only option for you. And I would really encourage you to think about what other options are there out there to fund the kind of business that you're trying to build. We've got lots of stuff, everything from the Wellcome Trust, if you're not aware of that. It's kind of like a fantastic organization out of the UK that has like a bunch of money that's available to put into startups. But I would really be thinking about trying to line it up with your goals, right? The type of business that you want to build. One of the challenges, again, with the folks at Perrin Achille was they raised like hundreds of millions of dollars and went public. And once you do that, you now are signing up to a set of objectives around growth and around profitability that you have to drive to. And that really determines your decision making. And so ultimately, that's why they were spending $50, $100 million on sales and marketing. And also, unfortunately, then that's why they couldn't sustain themselves. So I would really just think about what is the business that you want to build? What's the impact that you want to have? And then there's a whole bunch of different options. VC, a very good one, but lots of other ones too that you can think about and trying to match them up, because taking on investors is actually kind of one of the only like irreversible decisions in building a startup. And so it definitely justifies quite a lot of consideration and thought. So that's it. To summarize again, making sure you're prioritizing clinical outcomes, really focus on building a sustainable business model, like design that like you would design your product. Prove your go-to-market model before you start investing in it. Don't rely on should, it's dangerous. Watch your timing. And then finally, try and choose a funding strategy that matches your own goals.
That was awesome. I really appreciate Stevie going through that and sharing your learnings. We have a poll going on in the chat. I would encourage people to keep going with what they're focused on in terms of these 5 plus the bonus outcomes, sustainable model, etc. But also feel free to fire in with any questions you might have. We want to make sure you get maximum Steve insight time here. So feel free to put your questions in the chat, and we can start with some questions on our end while we wait for people to fire in.
I'm just going to stop sharing my screen too, actually, so I can see you all again.
Kinsley, you have a question on your side?
Oh, we actually just got a question in the chat, so I'll read that one out first. But Yelena asked, where do you see the greatest gaps or opportunities in this space right now?
Ooh, do you mean for somebody to build a startup? Sorry, I know this isn't your question, Kinsey.
Yes, Yelena says yes.
It's good. I'm gonna have to think about that. I'm gonna have to think about that and get back to you. It's a good question. Yeah.
And also we have a request to put up your last slide again, just with your information. I'll add Steve's information in the chat as well.
Yeah, it looks like we've had, a couple, the sort of themes for what people are focused on: outcomes, build a sustainable business model, or the 2 hot topics. Thoughts on the Headspace news this week?
Yeah, a lot of thoughts on that one, actually. So my kind of perspective is that we have what I'm calling like the platform wars in the US at the minute. So a lot of folks who try to build therapy platforms, essentially. So whether that's Spring, Lyra, Alma, all of these folks, trying to make therapists accessible to patients through their platform. And I think it's become a really competitive and difficult market. I think a lot of them are seeing that, right? Like we saw Lyra, unfortunately, let go a couple of people, I think last week as well. And so I think Headspace are just seeing the challenges of that market. I don't know, what that means for them. I think like I've written about the options that you have, like if you're playing in this space, if you're a therapy platform, if you're in the middle of the therapy platform wars, I think one of the options is that you actually kind of like get out of it and you say, I'm not so sure I want to fight this war anymore. I think there's other areas that I can go and play differently in. And Headspace, like their core competency that I always saw was 1 is in building digital products, and 2 in their brand. Since they merged with Ginger a few years ago, then they've became this kind of healthcare company that was trying to also play in like the therapy platform space. And I think that's really difficult. So I think one option for them is that they actually go and they say, we're just going to go back to what we were originally really, really good at and focus on that more heavily. And they've launched, talking about AI companions, they've launched Headspace Ebb, which is an AI companion. And I think if they could get that to take off, and then there'd be, a lot of reason for them to focus on that more than the others. But I don't know. It also makes me sad, right? Like I think, and a lot of people, some people in the space, I kind of cheer when they see like big players like go or have to like take a cut, and I'm just like, hey, there's a bunch of like I know a lot of these folks who work at these companies. They all really, really care deeply about the same things that we do. They're all trying really, really hard. And whether you agree with their approach or not is one thing, but like, let's not celebrate people losing their jobs, right? That's awful.
Hard. While we queue up the next question, I was thinking, Steve, maybe you could share, I don't know if you have a public link for it, but the eight different ideas you're thinking about. Like there was one around training, and that might be a good one for the person who asks about startup ideas.
Yeah, that's so true. Yeah. I'll pop this in the chat now.
Yeah, I love that one. It was a nice, like, just lots of sparks of ideas off of that. And then we have a question from Leo about thinking about niche products such as targeting child and families. Are there any adjustments that you think about for go-to-market there and business model related to kids and families, as an example?
Yes, I think it's even harder because you've actually insert another level into the adoption flow, which is parents, right? And so that's obviously more for the child end of it. If you're kind of at adolescents and young people, sometimes you're able to go a bit more direct to the young person themselves. So I think if you're building something for children, like you really need to think deeply about like how are you actually approaching parents, right? Because they're just such a key decision maker, obviously, in what that child does. Like Brightline are a really interesting company in this space, and they just announced, they had basically built all like virtual services to serve children, and they had basically announced they're shutting down most of their virtual services, and they're going back to brick and mortar. And a lot of the reason behind that was because they were saying like we weren't able to reach families, and by that they mean yes the children, but yeah also like the parents. And so they're saying if we can have clinics in an actual community, like that's what's going to build the trust and the awareness with the parents, which is going to then allow them to kind of bring their child to see us and engage with their treatment. So I think that would be just one specific example. If you're trying to serve the children and young people, just really, really think about how you engage the family.
And I know there's a kind of a second part to Leo's question, but regulation. Any tips on overcoming regulation barriers, given a lot of complexities with these different organizations?
No, you just got to do it, right? Like, I've had some really interesting conversations with founders where I basically asked them like similar questions, right? It's like, how do you ever come up with this problem? Or a big one I ask people is like, hey, you need to build for like 3 different people. You're trying to build for like your patients, like your providers, but then also for your payers. Like, how the hell do you like prioritize like which one you build for? And they were just like, we can't. Like, we just have to build for all 3 of them. Like, that's just, there's no kind of hack or easy way around this. And I think it's probably the same thing from a regulatory perspective, and especially in healthcare, right? It's like, and most of the regulations are there for for pretty good reasons.
The one thing I would push back on, but I'm definitely in the camp of what you just described, Steve, is that sometimes disruption comes from the outside, right? And you described one area where that's already happening, which is the AI therapy bots, right? And I'm not endorsing them.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that's the place that people should go, but I think one thing that's hard to grapple with when you're an entrepreneur in a nonprofit or for-profit in this world is all the things you described, right? If you have 3 customers, you have multiple regulatory systems you have to navigate through on those 3 customers, right? Kids, parents, they're being customer examples. That's a pretty hard maze to run through. But I think, so there's the forget it all, we're going to go crazy and we're going to go wild with not worrying about regulatory, like the Uber example that Leo provided, which again, I'm not saying you should do that, but that's something that's out there. The other one, which I think maps to a lot of the lessons you shared, is that if you right size your approach in terms of the business model, in terms of the cost structure of go to market, and you try to focus on a beachhead opportunity, then you can start to build up momentum and evidence. And so we have seen organizations who are at a state level working with an innovative regulator around different kinds of models. They're at a pilot level, but even within that one state, they can get to, if they keep their cost structures right and they're smart about their business model, they can get enough momentum to start laddering up on their business, and to your earlier point, laddering up on their measurement of outcomes, right? And starting to build that evidence that they then potentially can take to the next regulatory game in town, right? Which might be the next state or national or somewhere in between.
Yeah, 100%, right? So I think, when you talk about regulation, there's obviously a huge, broad span of what regulation actually means. I think there's a bunch of stuff that just really wouldn't encourage people to like break the law, right?
Yep.
Uber can do it, like probably wouldn't encourage people to do that. And if you look at, like, say, what character AI doing, having a chatbot that claims to be a psychologist, right? Okay, don't do that, right? That's just dumb.
Yeah.
But then there's other elements of regulation. So it's like, can you get your product FDA approved, right? And that's more like a question around, do you want to pursue that as an avenue? And I think definitely there, you can think more about the laddering approach, right? So a lot of companies who say, hey, look, FDA approval, that's coming down the line for us, right? We're going to tackle that beast in like 2 or 3 years, but we're going to start by doing it from a D2C perspective. We're not going to try and get it reimbursed by payers. And so we're going to build that up first. And then, we'll go and tackle those other regulatory hurdles down the line when we've got a bit more resources behind us. I think that's a very valid strategy.
Yeah, and there's actually a good example of that I know of. This Florio did exactly that. They went
right
to consumer with this virtual reality approach to supporting kids with behavioral challenges, and in parallel, they started the FDA track. They were able to, do all the lessons learned you described, right? They didn't raise too much. They didn't get way ahead of themselves. They kind of laddered up while they were patient and getting the FDA approval.
I wanted to ask a quick question about customer perceptions. I know we've talked about that a bit, but in the event that maybe you don't know what the customer, or rather the patient, feels about what your organization could be offering or putting forward, how would you suggest, or maybe what are things that you've seen that have been successful in almost surveying customer perceptions?
Yeah, good question. I think you just got to go and talk to them like one to one, right? Like, I know this is really hard and it's like difficult to do at scale, but like I always find I get so much better insight into somebody's perception from like having a conversation. Like surveys have a place, but like they're kind of hard because like, what do you ask somebody? It's like, how do you think about like AI chatbots? Are you for them, against them, scale of 1 to 10? Unless you're doing that like as a massive scale, it's difficult to get like actually helpful data. Whereas like, if you have like a casual conversation with somebody, it's like, hey, do you ever use like AI for your mental health? They're like, yeah, actually, I use ChatGPT. And like, what do you ask ChatGPT about your mental health? And then you actually get this like conversation, and the preference is like revealed to you, and instead of just stated in a survey. And I think that's really important. I think like if you want to do this at scale, what I see people do is, if they're working for a specific community, build a community for that, right? So, whether that's a forum or you have like a Facebook group, or, for people with ADHD who work in mining, right? Whatever else is the niche like thing. And then you build a community there, and then you've got people engaged with you on a real level. and you can get way better insights into like their preferences and what they think that way.
Love that. Kinsley and I could talk to you all day, Steve. I know you have you have a day job. We want to let you get back to it. Really appreciate just all the knowledge you've shared and the work more broadly that you do with your newsletter and consultancy. So encourage folks to sign up there if they're not already a newsletter subscriber. And a quick note, Kinsley shared this in the chat, but we are looking for innovators who are trying to scale in the child and family mental health space. If you're looking for a partner from Georgetown and our network of researchers and clinicians and beyond to help you with validating your outcomes and to help you with your go-to-market, please check out the website that Kinsley shared. And with that, we will we'll let everybody get back to their day. Thanks again, Steve, for all that you do.
No, thank you guys. This was so much fun. Thanks.
Thank you everyone for joining. We'll see you soon, and feel free to join us tomorrow.